Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 66th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today, we have a discussion of COVID-19, race, and emergency management with Joki Marumba and Dee Dee Bennett. You can catch COVID calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube Live. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also hear COVID calls recorded as podcasts on podbean.com, iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for guests, future topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, June 15th, 2020, there are 7,969,003 confirmed cases globally of COVID-19, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. That's up from 7,578,078 reported on Friday. Of those, 2,105,482 are in the United States, up from 2,036,429 reported on Friday. There's now a total of 115,998 deaths reported in the United States from COVID-19. That's up from 114,195 deaths reported on Friday. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story every day, and I'd like to continue that now. Headline is Annabelle Francisco de Brito, 90, saw the world as a merchant marine, but was the heart of a North Philadelphia block, by Valerie Russ. This appeared June 2nd, 2020, in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Renita de Brito said neighbors called her father Nemo because they weren't sure how to pronounce Annabelle. Born in Cape Verde, off the coast of West Africa, Mr. de Brito traveled the world as a merchant marine, spending time in Portugal, France, the Netherlands, Italy, and Brazil. But when he retired in 1968, he made North Philadelphia his home, specifically the 1800 block of Master Street, where his immigrant father and stepmother had settled years before. Mr. de Brito, then 39, found work driving a truck delivering heavy kegs of beer for Schmidt Brewery Distribution Company. In 1972, he wed Renata Rawls, who lived across the street. She died last year. The couple had 2 daughters, but Mr. de Brito had 10 other children around the globe. Mr. de Brito became a beloved community leader. He loved people, his daughter said. He liked to get out to see people, and he loved to tell jokes and make people laugh. He was also a no-nonsense man who spoke out if he saw young men getting into trouble. He would say, "Hey man, what are you doing? You know you shouldn't be out here doing this," his daughter said. He was healthy and strong and looked young for his age, and he loved taking long walks even after turning 90 last September. He walked from North Philly to Center City, and he could walk faster than me, his daughter said. That's why the family thought he would beat the coronavirus when he fell ill. But Mr. de Brito died from COVID-19 on Friday, April 24th, at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital. Born in 1929, Mr. de Brito was the oldest child of Francisco Brito Sr. and Maria Silva. After high school, he joined the Merchant Marine. His first language was Portuguese, but he also spoke Italian, French, Spanish, and Dutch. Anywhere we went, he would know everyone's language and could speak to them. He made a lot of friends that way, his daughter said. He loved telling stories about the places he had seen. But his favorite trip was to Rome, when he and his brother, Monsignor Federico Brito, attended the canonization of St. Catherine Drexel of Philadelphia. A devout Catholic and a member of St. Cyprian Roman Catholic Church, Mr. de Brito was thrilled to attend a mass said by Pope John Paul II. The funeral was live streamed on Wednesday, May 6th. Okay, I'd like to turn to our discussion for today. And to do that, I'm going to introduce our guests. So, first guest is Dee Dee Bennett. Dr. Bennett is an assistant professor in the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at the University at Albany, State University of New York. Her research interests include emergency management, socially vulnerable populations during disasters, emergency communication, disaster policy, and mobile wireless communication. She broadly examines the influence and integration of advanced technologies on the practice of emergency management and for use by vulnerable populations. Dr. Bennett received her PhD from Oklahoma State University in fire and emergency management. In addition to bringing expertise in emergency management, she has a unique academic background, having received both her MS in public policy and bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the Georgia Institute of Technology. She is an advisory board member for the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. My second guest is Njoki Marumba. Early in her PhD graduate studies at Oklahoma State University, she briefly worked with a USAID-funded consultancy team. The team was funded to develop a national pandemic preparedness plan for Kenya in collaboration with Kenya's National Disaster Operations Center. During that consultancy, a colleague recommended the book The New Plagues: Pandemics and Poverty in a Globalized World by Stefan Kaufman. The confluence of these two events resulted in Njoki's dedicated focus on understanding how people, systems, and institutions interact with public health disasters and pandemics. Her dissertation focus was on the role social vulnerability indicators played during the H1N1 pandemic of 2009. Dr. Njoki Marumba now teaches emergency management and disaster science at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Dr. Marumba and Dr. Bennett, thank you so much for joining me on COVID Calls today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
So what I'd like to do is start the discussion the way I have with all of these, is just to find out the COVID-19 situation where you are. So if you wouldn't mind bringing us up to date, and in these last weeks, I've also been asking if people would be willing to share the situation regarding George Floyd protest where you are, if there's anything going on there, so that our viewers and listeners can have a broad sense of how things are where you're located. So Dee Dee, could I start with you?
Sure. So I had to look up it. I'm in New York, but since most of the pandemic information from the state is about the city, I figure I tell you what's going on upstate. There are, in this area where the school is, close to 2,000 confirmed, and 102 deaths up here. Which is remarkably different than what's happening in New York City, where there's over 209,000 confirmed and over 17,000 deaths. So what I've noticed that's a little bit different from my family elsewhere is that there's a change a little bit in the culture around masks and social distancing happening here than there is in other places. However, I did hear in the news recently that Cuomo was upset with some folks down in the city and was it Long Island and Manhattan, or the Hamptons? Sorry, the Hamptons and the Manhattan area, because sometimes when we're opening these locations up, people are they forget, right? So you forget that it's a pandemic ongoing, especially since there has been a shift in our news, right? So when I'm looking at the news, they don't have that ticker anymore about what's going on. And so that can also lead to some people forgetting that there's a pandemic and that people are still dying at really grotesque numbers. So that's kind of where we are with the pandemic. There have been some protests up here with regard to George Floyd's murder, and been here in Albany area, and that I haven't seen anything recently, but that has happened in the last 3 weeks. It hasn't been as ongoing as some of the other areas that I've seen.
Thank you for situating us how things are where you are. Njoki, same question to you.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, and thank you very much for the invitation to this conversation today. So I live in Oklahoma, and I also live in Omaha, Nebraska, whenever I'm working. But my family is here in Oklahoma currently. I would like to say that the numbers, obviously, statewide, sometimes obviously are very different when it comes to what's going on, in that little town that you live, or in the big town. So I do not live in a very big town in Oklahoma. I am about an hour away from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And in Stillwater, Oklahoma, which is a very historic and very important town, based on what's going on currently. But what's happening in Stillwater, Oklahoma, is, just to break down the numbers, is that between the first 3 months, until up until May, we only had 22 infections in my town, right? And then we had, a few, almost about a week and a half to 2 weeks of zero new infections happening in the town. And so we started the process of sort of reopening. Okay, which is a very deceptive term, because you're reopening from what, and COVID is still here. And there's the misconception that we are already past the first wave, which is not necessarily the case. We really are strictly still in the first one. So what has happened since, in conjunction with Memorial Day happening and all the reopening, is that in my town, we now have, since June 5th to uh, about 12th, we have had about 25 new infections happen, right? So I like that disaggregation, because it tells the story of, what is going on. So we have, central locations where people like to go, major stores, in as major as they can get in a little town, having to close down, restaurants and things like that. So that's what's going on. With regard to the George Floyd scenario, is there have been people who have, made a stand and protested, and protests looking, very different sometimes than what you're seeing in the major cities. Some of the ways in which my little town is actually calling, you know to question some of the practices that have been going on, is looking at the historical processes that have existed, for example, in the naming of buildings, whether on campus or off campus at Oklahoma State University, and participating online to express protest in some ways that are different, other than what we're seeing in the major cities.
And the president's rally will be in Tulsa later this week. Is that right?
Yes, there will be a rally, the first rally, launching up the new presidential campaign, is going to be in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, Oklahoma is a historic town, and the day on which this indoor rally was supposed to be held, was going to be on Juneteenth, another very important historical day, marking the ending of slavery in this country. Okay, so just again, a confluence of two very historic, very important dates to the people who live in Tulsa and the area of Greenwood, Tulsa, where there was the first Black Wall Street. In fact, it was also known as Little Africa at some point. Okay, and we know that there were protests and the burning down of the area in 1921. After a young Black man was accused of assaulting a white woman, and we lost 300 lives then. It was a police person that reported this attack, this supposed attack of the young man. And so it's almost surreal to be dealing with the issues of Breonna, of George Floyd, and all the other people's lives in 2020, almost 100 years since Greenwood.
Thank you for giving us that really, really important context, and that history, and that legacy that maybe a lot of Americans either hadn't been aware of, or had forgotten about, if they had ever been taught it. And now it comes back onto the front page of the newspaper. I'm assuming it was not President Trump's intention to invite Americans into a deeper exploration of African American history, but there it is, and it's, I think, been, to me, quite important also following the health officials there, if I'm correct. Maybe not the state official, but the Tulsa City health officials have expressed publicly concern about the rally.
Absolutely. They would be remiss if they didn't do that. They would be remiss, but they are professionals doing their job and doing the best that they can to inform people. And there has been a shift in dates from the 19th to the 20th, which to me is still a slap in the face, to put it mildly, because it still does not reflect or respect the history of the place, the history of the state, which has the largest number of Native American communities as well, who have been just absolutely decimated in previous public health disasters, and also stand the risk of once again being impacted, along with the African American communities and other communities in the Tulsa areas. It's not going to be just limited to the people who attend this indoor activity on the 20th, a day later. It's about everyone else as well.
Absolutely. I want to get to know a little bit more about both of your research areas of interest. And Didi, if it's okay, I'll start with you. Why were you drawn into this kind of work? What are some of the key questions that you work on in your research at this time?
It's kind of a long, convoluted story about how I got involved, but it has to do with partially about my work that I was doing at Georgia Tech at the time as a research engineer, and then going on to get my public policy master's, in which I was able to work on emergency management and vulnerable populations. And through that, I got introduced to this emergency management world, the research thereof, and was really, really excited about what I was doing, and was able to see the connections between some of the work I was doing in the engineering side, some of the work that was happening in the policy side, and then learning about how that fit into the application and the practice thereof. So I tend to look at a lot of things dealing with vulnerable populations, and that crosses the gamut. A lot of my research has been with people with disabilities, but I'm also looking at racial and ethnic minorities as of late, and immigrant communities, those with limited English proficiency. All of those tend to cross over my research. I also recently have been doing a lot of work in and around COVID-19 as it relates to emergency management and some of my other interests. So I'm looking right now at how COVID-19 messaging is reaching older adults. I'm also looking at technological innovations and how those have influenced or the response of COVID-19, as well as how it's changed our lives because of our response to COVID-19. And I'm also looking at the racial and ethnic minority communities, and especially in New York State here, and how what we can learn from disaster research in terms of what everybody is looking at as the health disparities. But I think we can look at it a little bit broader and look at it in terms of these vulnerable populations and some of the other aspects that actually fit into the health disparities. And I know you have some other questions, so I'm picking my words carefully.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, we have an hour, 40 more minutes, so we have plenty of time to go into depth. I mean, I'm so impressed with the breadth of what you're describing there. And I do want to talk in a minute a little bit more about vulnerable populations and what that means. Choki, let me come to you though and ask sort of the same question. What were the areas of interest that brought you into this kind of research, and what are the main questions that you work on right now?
Actually, so very much a story about meanderings, right? I started with my first degree in Kenya, where I did my country of origin, where I did a communications and community development work, and absolutely just loved working in the community, working with the community, and seeing people, especially women's groups at that time, organizing and being able to really lift themselves up out of various realities that they were living. All right. And then I moved to the US and did a master's in hospitality management, worked in food service, and when I was working in food service management after my first degree, two things I was interested in is the multicultural education processes of of students other than your predominantly white students, interested in their learning processes, because I saw a lot of international students as well as marginalized community students in the US. So I was curious about how they learned, but I was also curious from a hospitality angle about preparedness. I didn't know the language then, right? I wondered how institutions of higher learning, where I was working at the time, prepare for. I lived in Tornado Alley, still do. So I was curious about our preparedness for that, right? And then broaden that out to food security and insecurity. And for the longest time, that's what I was quite interested in, beginning there. But then as life goes, connections with people, conversations with people, and I got introduced to Dr. Brenda Phillips. And through her, I was able to learn more about the disaster management approaches and teaching. And I was like, this is it. This is what I wanted to do. So I changed my PhD trajectory and got involved in disaster management in that whole field. Another area which I've also been very, very interested and invested in is in voluntary work around. I am an American Red Cross volunteer. So just working with that and seeing again and again the kind of people who end up, in shelters, the kind of people who end up just being so disparately impacted, right? So, my interest therefore in disaster management is about the people who are the most and the worst affected by disasters. And then I'm also really interested in understanding why. Okay, so pandemics are my key interest. And so understanding what it is, what the social determinants of health are, right? The external realities that people live with and how those merge to make people more susceptible and more at risk for public health emergencies has been my area of interest.
So, really, Scott, what you have here is like 1 degree from Brenda Phillips here, because Brenda Phillips is also my advisor. So you have two people here that have 1 degree from Brenda Phillips. That's how you chose us.
Mm-hmm.
I thought I had taken. I didn't realize that that's what I had assembled in this conversation. I think it's tremendous, and it's also speaks to the degree to which disaster research is still. I think it's a big tent. It's getting bigger, but it's sometimes a little bit small or a little close. And the work that everybody, I think, is doing right now to try to draw more and more people into this work. But I think it's really important also to acknowledge our intellectual trajectories and those people who.
It is, and also to acknowledge how multidisciplinary it is. To the degree that it touches on so many different facets of life and living, right? That sometimes people might not have the language for it, but that's exactly what they're looking for.
Let's talk for a second about emergency management. And I know it seems a little basic, but people who've been following COVID calls, we've had a lot of people from public health, and we've had a lot of discussion of law enforcement. And a lot of talk about disaster research. We've had comparably little about emergency management. I did have Sam Montano on, I had Patrick Roberts on, great discussions, and others who've talked about emergency management. But this is really pretty squarely getting into your areas of interest and work. Maybe, Didi, could you just walk us through just at a basic level, when we talk about emergency management in the United States, who are we referring to? Where do we find them?
So I'll use what we have as principles of emergency management, kind of basic things, is that emergency management is this managerial function that's supposed to help communities and facilitate their response and recovery efforts. So it's akin to some of the emergency services. And so some people get involved in that, but it's not necessarily that, right? So you have ways of bringing up the response, the recovery, the mitigation, and the preparedness measures that are happening at the community level. You have emergency managers that help to facilitate that. They help to organize, they help to coordinate, and they help to educate the public on best practices for their communities. I think that's one of the more basic ways of just saying this is what an emergency manager does. And that's true whether it's New York City that has a whole lot of emergency managers and specialized people that work in there. And it is for some of the smaller towns like in Nebraska where someone is wearing multiple hats and they're the emergency manager and they're something else, right? So a lot of times you see this being convoluted with law enforcement because that person may wear a police chief hat and emergency manager. You may see it convoluted with firefighters as well. Same thing. Sometimes that person is being tapped to do that. But we're seeing a professionalization happening in the field in which people are beginning to recognize the unique differences that take place at large scale disasters as opposed to your everyday emergencies. Joki.
Joki, do you want to add anything to that?
Yes,
Because
yes.
it's
Go ahead, Scott.
no, please, thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree with what the way Didi puts it, and the way I like to also tell it, especially to my students or when I'm trying to explain what I do to my family members who might not quite grasp it, is that we're at the back of the house in a sense. The role that you do not see, and by back of the house I mean placing it within the context of the disaster phases, is that what you see typically, or the attention that disasters and catastrophes get, is typically during the response phase, right? We are the people who are doing everything else between recovery and mitigation and preparedness. We are the ones who are helping support the blue sky events, the blue sky activities, and the spectrum is wide, about the different roles that are played. So we are not wearing the police uniform, we are not wearing the EMT uniform, but we are the ones who are actually supporting and linking people and leveraging social capacity.
I would add that there's not just, I think sometimes people think emergency managers only get involved when it's a natural hazard or something like that. They're actually involved in all hazards and all potential hazards. So you'll see emergency managers involved in everything from, a tornado, hurricane, as well as some terrorist activities and maybe man-made chemical spills, things like that, if they're large enough. Also, you'll see them involved in things that aren't necessarily disasters, but that have the potential where you have people coming together. So some of your large scale events, like when we had them before, like Super Bowl and things like that, you'll see emergency managers are involved, and usually are very much important in just keeping and understanding what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And if I may also add that from an international and from a global perspective, is there are a lot of people doing the work without the title, right? They might not have the work, and they may not look like the part, but that's the work that they're doing. They are informally working somewhere in a village and to make things happen. They are the repositories of information. They are the repositories of systems, right, on how to behave or what to do during a locust invasion, right, or a chronic unfolding disaster like a drought and famine, right? So it's work that's ongoing, and it's work, just being barely 50 years, that continually needs to be highlighted and amplified.
That's a very good point. I think one of the things to mention here is that when we were learning about some of the areas in which emergency managers get involved, we looked at these rapid onset disasters, all the slow onset disasters. And for the life of me, the whole time we're learning about pandemics and droughts and things of that nature, everybody is putting that onto more developing countries and things like that, as opposed to thinking about the potential for something here. And it's funny well, not funny, but it's interesting, to hear a lot of people saying, so now where does this fit within emergency management? Where in my mind, it's like, oh, it's always been there. It's just how we handle it and how we understand it has been different because, well, this is the United States and we haven't really dealt with anything like this large.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
and also, understanding that you said something that's really important. Mainstreaming disasters and catastrophes, right. They've always been there. So, what do the different cultures tell us? What do those guardians tell us that they did? And can we leverage that on how we are, propagating or trying to enhance emergency management, rather than trying to introduce it like it's this entirely new Western concept, right? That and transferability does not happen like that, right? So it's quite a broad and interesting area, and bringing in the global component of it. We need to understand that yes, all disasters are local, but even as much as they are local, you need to understand, that local can go to global pretty quick, right? And pandemics are showing us that climate change is also going to be something that we have to absorb in that sense as well.
I want to remind people that you're listening to COVID Calls, and we're talking with Joki Marumba and Dede Bennett about emergency management, and my head is absolutely tingling because of these many different things that have been brought to bear in the last few minutes, and particularly this very powerful idea about not waiting to sort of say, well, does this fit the typology of what emergency management is, but actually work by sort of observing the functions that people serve and see how that maps on to, what emergency management is, which to me is a very creative approach and maybe a very practical approach, depending on, not everything is the United States, not everything is FEMA. And I worry that often in our news reporting, and because it's hard to report disasters, but in our news reporting, it's like FEMA is emergency management and everything else is we don't understand what that is. You're describing a much more diverse.
Yes. And if I may too, we're also we're talking about function. Even when we look at how we approach people with disabilities, right? It's looking at what are the functional needs, like how do we support that rather than a medicalized, nice and tight definition of this is what this is what the approaches need to be. It's more like how can we support, how can we come alongside?
Well, yeah, and I guess that makes a good point, is that the best way is to bring the communities in to the fold so that you actually understand what it is and you're not looking from the outside and saying, hey, we're just going to do this for you or tell you this is the only way. The one thing is, everyone in disaster management, emergency management, disaster science researchers, tend to think, disasters start locally. That's important, but we can still learn from others and actually learn about what's happening. I think in this field, we need to be continual learners and be open to what's happening and see how this thing can be applied elsewhere, or, what are the best practices, and actually learn from each other. I know there are a lot of organizations and societies for the emergency management field that are trying to do that. There has to be some real learning happening, so that we're not continuously making the same mistakes and assumptions each time.
I want to ask you both about an area that you specialize in and a term you've used, which is vulnerable populations. And it may not be one, it seems to make sense of what it is on the face of it, and yet you both talked about it in slightly different ways. Can we talk a little bit about what you mean by that? And I'm also interested as a historian about how we come to that sort of a judgment. In other words, how does history produce vulnerability? And is it possible to not be a vulnerable population once you've been vulnerable? I'm interested in thinking about who vulnerable populations are, but also how that moves across time. Either of you want to take a first pass at that?
Yeah, I can. I would like to make one statement about vulnerability not being static, right? It's not this one system or one approach or one identifier that either an individual or a group of people have, or that a descriptive is used on, right? It changes and shifts depending on what's going on, right? So it's almost like there's got to be some elasticity around it, right? And you cannot talk vulnerability without discussing resilience, because people have lived through these events. Historically, people have lived through. So understanding what is it that has afforded them resilience and how can we build on that resilience. So coming back to Dede's comment about, bringing people around the table or around the fire to make these decisions and discussions around, how do we not only identify what our vulnerabilities are and get defined by those vulnerabilities, but how do we amplify what has enabled us to survive historically, and how we can contort and shape ourselves so that we are able, with the current challenges, to survive and thrive through the challenges that we have at the time.
Yeah, there's an interesting discussion that has been ongoing. I've seen on Twitter about the term vulnerable populations, and some people having kind of a visceral reaction to this term, only because when we say it, we're saying, okay, it's usually these individuals or these groups of people or something like that. And I think it's that naming that gets people, up under their skin. And I think it might just be not the naming of it, but how that is interpreted and how it has been interpreted in our field. So when you have vulnerable populations, I like to clarify that it's the characteristics of the individual group, but also potentially their situations, and that we can move in and out. Like Joki was saying, it's not static. It is dynamic. You can move in and out depending on the disaster itself or depending on your actual situation. And I had to explain this recently to a group, is that, when we say, oh, it's certain racial and ethnic minorities, for example, and sometimes it could be based on your gender. It's like, okay, well, I'm an African-American woman, but that does not explain my vulnerability by itself, right? It has to have something to do with other factors that are happening in my life. I might be more or less vulnerable than the next African-American woman because of my access to certain resources, my access to power, my understanding of what's happening, maybe because I'm even more prepared. So there's a lot of different things that go into vulnerability. And I really love, and since I'm an academic, I'll go ahead and cite some stuff. But, Kale started 2007, started talking about vulnerability and the term. And even when I use this term with, practitioners or use it with students, what they hear when they hear the term vulnerability or socially vulnerable populations is it's this small segment of the population that we're talking about, right? And so if I give you numbers on this one small section of the population, say people with disabilities, somewhere around 23%, and then you're like, okay, well, we're supposed to be, doing things for the majority. So, 20%, where's our, what are we really talking about? But Kale's talked about the fact that once you start adding up all the different vulnerable populations, you are over 50% of the US population, just for US alone. Again, vulnerability and social vulnerability changes based on where you are and based on the society as well. In the United States here, we look at people with disabilities, we look at older adults, we look at, racial and ethnic minorities. You can just go look at the census, go look at those who can't be in the same category and then add, so if we're looking at children and older adults, guess what? You're already close to 40. You can't be both a child and an older adult. You're already past 40% there in terms of potential vulnerability. So the idea, this idea that we have that we are planning for the majority is actually very misleading for a lot of people. I don't believe that we should be practicing for the majority. I believe that we should be practicing for the most vulnerable, because that's where we get all of our hangups. And if we did, we would actually be doing the best for the most. And it's an old thought process that comes out of engineering for me, in which, there was a term about universal design. How do we design different products? And this idea that, designing it for the majority always leaves out all these different people. But if we designed with universal use in mind, that, we would capture everybody. And I always go back to that, because when we start planning for these communities, when we start looking at the communities that actually need the help, you go back to some of the major disasters, you realize they all have something in common. They are these populations that needed specific help that we weren't giving because we were too busy thinking about the majority. And it's also a misnomer, because the majority is a vulnerable population.
It's incredibly powerful the way you're describing this. And this idea that vulnerable populations at any given time, some of us might fall into that category.
Yeah, not even could be in a vulnerable population. So there's everybody could be, and I don't know your specifics. I haven't talked to you, but I know that it's possible that you may have a disability I don't know about. You may have different things that's going on in your family structure, or in your income, or in your housing structure, that leads you to be a little bit more vulnerable than one would assume, just face value.
So to me, it's also it's really revealing some of the deeper history of emergency management, sort of cutting out of kind of military mindset, that you could just kind of divide the population up according to where it was, and you would just sort of implement a solution. And that we still, in many ways, are kind of what you're describing, evolving, moving out of that and thinking much more of emergency management, reflecting society as it is and as we want it to be. I mean, there's sort of an aspirational aspect here as I hear you both talking, which is, to me, there's an intersection here with how we think about, excuse me, our democracy, and a democracy that's aware of social difference, but provides equality. Mm-hmm. And I wonder about that, but I also worry about that with emergency management, because, the track record of emergency management, as I read it, as perceived by minority communities, I'm thinking of Hurricane Katrina here, for example. I mean, don't some communities have a real leg to stand on when they say emergency management hasn't worked for us? We've been left out of equal protection in a disaster.
If I may say something about that, you have a point in that there is going to be communities, and with reference to Hurricane Katrina, there are communities that were left out of the conversation. There are communities that were just left out entirely when it came to trying to respond to what it is that was happening on the ground, right? But if you understand emergency management from the perspective that, take an institution like FEMA, or even just the federal government, emergency management really does center around the reality that there is not a single organization anywhere in the world that can actually successfully and fully encompass the needs of people after impact. That is one. The other thing that we do whenever we look at the Katrina reality is that we have to understand who is emergency management, right? Who is FEMA, for example, and what is the role of FEMA, and where is FEMA placed in the context of federal government, right? In what ways are they enabled? In what ways are they curtailed, right? The role of the mayor, the role of the governor, how do all those dynamics come into play so that by the time the policies are implemented at the person level, at the community family level, right, they are just absolutely off kilter to what the needs of that community is, right? So there's a loss and there's a failure to really understand and comprehend what emergency management is about, right? And the role that emergency management is. And when you look at where we are placed, where, for example, FEMA is placed, right, is within just a conglomerate of other, departmental organizations in this country, right? And we have seen historically that when FEMA has been given the support that they needed, placed as cabinet level positions, right, resourced by people who were familiar, professional, and had practiced emergency management, right, then they have done better. So it is true that there has been, groups that have fallen through the cracks, and that's where emergence comes in, to support that kind of, falling through the cracks. But there's a failure on very many levels in as far as trying to support the work of emergency management as is needed.
Yeah. So Scott, how much time do we have?
Because
if you're going to bring up Hurricane Katrina, that could have been an entire discussion all by itself, and probably extra A, B.
Well, we'll bring you for a part 2, but let's get started on it.
Yes. The thing is with, it's a very visible disaster, one that a lot of people, especially in our age group, remember. It's harder for me to even use that as an example in my classrooms because most of the students do not remember Hurricane Katrina, believe it or not, and don't know anything about it. So when I'm looking at Hurricane Katrina, it's hard for me to answer your question because there are so many levels of problems. One of the first one is just we need a different culture around preparedness at a national level, just for us to understand what it is that what it is that emergency managers do. What is it about preparing for something? I mean, at this point, you have some preppers, right? And then the rest of us and trying to figure out what's going on. But when you say, what is the problem with FEMA in terms of Hurricane Katrina? There are a lot of things missing in that question, right? Because we've already established that disasters start locally, what's happening at the local level, and FEMA already starts out, it's Federal Emergency Management Agency. So how do you get from that federal level all the way down to what's happening at the ground? And when you look at a lot of different documentaries, if you remember what happened, if you look at some of the research, you'll realize that there was a disconnect from the time they started their response all the way to what was happening at the ground level, not barring the fact that there was also issues going on within, all of the different major cities and along the Gulf Coast that were impacted. And in particular, I know a lot of people like to bring up New Orleans, but there were a lot of different things going on along the coast, and all of them had very similar concerns. And it's that they had some assumptions built in that didn't make any sense. It wasn't based on their practice. It wasn't based on the research. And then there was also things that were ongoing on multiple levels of governance. That was happening. A really good documentary, or a documentary I like that was put together that can kind of discuss some of that. And you can see it from their own words, right? And that is When the Levees Broke. When you watch that and you hear from the governor, you hear from the mayor, you hear from folks at the federal level and others who were brought in, later on, you start to realize all the different disconnects. There was some political things going on there. There were some practice and policy issues going on. There were also just, I don't trust this person kind of thing going on. And then that led to, I didn't trust that all of this was happening down there. I thought that was overblown. You also have layers of how the media's portrayal of what happened and what they actually showed impacted how it was seen from some government officials, and then how they responded in return. Some of this is just what we start to feed, what kind of narrative we want to feed about what happened. And it also relates a lot to some of the myths of disaster.
So glad that you mentioned When the Levees Broke. And I use that when I teach, and it's a documentary, if you're not familiar with it, that was directed by Spike Lee. And one of the points of the documentary, as I read it, as I watch it, is also examining structural racism in American history.
It does.
So this is, I think this is something that I've seen some talking around the edges, but this is one of the reasons I was really eager to speak with both of you today as well. And that's to get your thoughts about the ways that emergency management meets structural racism. That is how you meet communities where they are, and acknowledge, as you're talking about, Joki, resilience, and talking about vulnerability. Sometimes that resilience that has been produced is a direct result of structural racism and segregation in American life. And that's part of the Hurricane Katrina story. I think it's obviously been on everyone's mind now with George Floyd and the pandemic happening simultaneously. Communities of color have suffered disproportionately in both cases. But I wonder how we read that back into emergency management. Is emergency management prepared to deal with the racial realities of America today?
That's a very interesting question. It's how do they deal with it, or how do they manage through it? Because some of this has to, if it's systemic, if it's institutional, then there's only so much that they can do, because again, some of these things are built into our laws, and emergency managers aren't lawmakers. So you have to be pretty clear about what it is that you're hoping that they can accomplish, being able to be aware that there is systemic racism present, that institutional racism exists, that our policies are, often biased and don't think about those that are most marginalized in our communities. And I say that specifically because even when we think about some of the advances that have been made along all the different vulnerable populations, as we like to call them, we start to realize that there are policies that didn't take them into consideration, or takes them into consideration only using certain viewpoints about what they're capable of. One of the things that comes up a lot in emergency management, especially in some after action reports and things like that, is this bewilderment in that the communities are able to do something on their own, and if they're doing this on their own, where do we fit in? How do we deal with this? Why are they meeting this unmet need? Aren't we supposed to be involved? There's some things that I see that continuously happen around these emerging groups. When you're not helping the communities, all of a sudden they find ways to help themselves. And sometimes that is through, just them trying to take care of themselves. There can be lessons learned in what they're doing and why they're doing it. There's also something happening in terms of just historic prevalence. We've only been doing this since was it 79? So on some real level for FEMA to be involved. Some voluntary organizations have been doing this since the early 1900s. Some really historic communities that have been around for a while, they've been doing it for longer, and they have a lot of different things in place. One I bring up a lot is in South Carolina is the Gullah people in South Carolina have different things. I've heard of a lot on some Native American tribes. I've heard a lot in the Caribbean islands. So there's a lot of things that we can learn from the communities that we're serving if we allow them into the table, at the table. And when I say that, I don't want it to seem like just by inviting someone there to the table that's enough. They have to feel welcomed, and they have to feel like their voices are actually heard. So calling someone up randomly and saying, hey, come on to this table and tell us everything, or we can tell you, that's not the same thing. Another thing that I've seen a lot that's happened is this, it's a socialization of I think, emergency management officials or emergency services in general, is this idea that if I just tell you, if I go and talk to the community, talk at a community, that is the equivalent of bringing in this whole community approach that Fugate kind of started. And that's not the same thing. Talking at someone is not the same thing as bringing them to the table and listening to what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd like to add on to that. And Scott, you actually asked that question within the context of what's going on with the protest against not just George Floyd, but the systems that have supported the possibility that we can have the George Floyd of this day, right? Exactly. And how does emergency management operate? And I'd like to just point on two key nuggets that I know I use in emergency management, and a lot of my colleagues when it comes to just sharing information with our students, the students that come to us, right? And I'd like to reference the social component, the reality about how we define the progression of vulnerability. Understanding that in my classes, I know that everybody might not end up being an emergency manager, but I do go ahead and present to them approaches about the progression of vulnerability that has to do with root causes, right? Trying to get to the depth of where the problem is, understanding what the power structures are, right? And understanding how those in turn impact people directly, impact how people are governed, impact the disparities across the board as well. Dynamic pressures, looking at those. What are the legal frameworks that need to be challenged or supported, right? In as far as maintaining a status quo, what are those? What are the freedoms? Real press freedom. We have seen that in this country becoming a conversation point, right? Where the press are sometimes coerced into a certain narrative, right? Something that we know hasn't historically happened in this country. We need to talk about urbanization. We need to talk about globalization. And then we also need to talk about unsafe conditions, all part of progression of vulnerability approach, the progression of vulnerability approach, which is applicable not just in the US, but internationally as well. I'm not the only one. Emergency management is not the only one using a systems approach to try and resolve or try and address some of the issues that exist. So it's emergency management and a whole lot of other people coming alongside it. The other real quick comment I'd like to make is that we historically have done a really good job in doing the research, and some disciplines better than others. We're fairly new, but we're getting there. But there's something to be said about mass culture, right? Looking at, for example, what is going on in this country at this moment and the impact that is having abroad as well, okay? Where systems are being called to question that have existed. And what is very interesting to observe is that through mass culture and the movement. And I attribute this thought to Dr. Kiguro Macharia, an independent scholar from Kenya. Is in a conversation that last week, he was talking about how we need to identify that sometimes policies and practice can change much quicker than when they are moved by mass culture, like what's happening here in this country and abroad, than just the same old process that is set in place, the framework that are set in place, because those are slower moving. So they're not as nimble, right, to respond and react to what needs to change. And sometimes then bringing it back to emergency management is that I think there needs to be that kind of mass cultural movement around how we perceive risk and how we develop a preparedness culture from local levels to the international level.
Do you expect then in this moment to see changes within emergency management profession, for example, in terms of who becomes emergency managers? It's not a profession in the United States that's incredibly diverse, I don't think, historically speaking.
Here's what I know, is that whether we agree to change our definitions and our applications, people will insist that we do, in being better prepared for COVID and the second wave of COVID and the next pandemic that comes along. People will put us to the fire for what it is we do. And by that, I mean they will hold us accountable, right? So we either change or we change, right? Because otherwise we're not going to be responsive to the same people we think we are serving.
Well, I do believe that there's going to be some policy changes. I totally think that this is one of those major events that leads to policy change on multiple levels. I also believe that some of the things that are happening is not as surprising, I guess, to me, and that's sad to say, and it's because Joki knows, we all know that disasters tend to exacerbate the inequalities that we already have that are ongoing, and that's not just from a standpoint of looking at it from COVID-19 lens. And I did a presentation in I think early March or late March, sometime right after everybody was looking around, oh, COVID's happening, everybody's closing down, what's going on? And I wanted to point out then, and I think it's important to point out now, that as we focus on COVID-19, or as we were focusing on COVID-19, what did you think was going to be the impacts? Everybody started looking at older adults, people with pre-existing conditions, and at some point they started looking at some of these essential workers and the fact that, hey, this is where we're going to see the most problems. And I said, I think there's going to be two sets of problems. There's going to be a problem around the vulnerability of certain populations to COVID-19, which most likely will take the form of having that social vulnerability lens, because we're not talking about the stuff that Joki brought up, which is basically that pressure and release model, the root causes, dynamic pressures, unsafe conditions that are leading some people to be more vulnerable than others. But on top of that, during the response and the recovery, everything that we're doing, even those who are not being impacted by COVID, they are being squeezed because of our responses to COVID-19, right? So now we have moved to using technology in a different way. Now we've moved to a lot of people getting laid off, all these different factors, the economy changing. Who gets hurt the most there, right? And so you've already seen this economic numbers, these figures. You've already seen the unemployment numbers, and they also look like marginalized populations, right? The same racial and ethnic minority populations that we were kind of a little bit nervous about with COVID-19, and now we can see, yes, they are more susceptible to die and to catch COVID-19. And guess what? They're also more susceptible to lose their job and all these other things. So that is again, that is that pressure and release model. That is also the health disparities model. There's all these different models that we can look at that basically takes into account not just what's happening at the individual level, but what's happening in their community, what's happening in their household, what's happening with the politics or the policies that they are subjected to, and what's happening at the societal level about our general culture around either those individuals or about what is happening to those individuals. So if we start to layer all of this together. If we look for connections, we start to realize, wow, these populations that I am a part of, are really being squeezed in a way that other populations in the United States are not, in terms of, just employment, education, healthcare, and even in what's happening with our law enforcement and other policies. I mean, I can keep going on. There's security. There's a whole bunch of different things that we can start to layer on top of each other. And I know you mentioned something, or you asked us a question in an email about this idea of whether or not systemic racism exists, and it does. And I just think, what was the guy's name? Is it Chad Wolf? Right.
The director of the Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah, there's something.
Acting director.
So there's something I posted a long time ago. There's this concept of willful ignorance, right? So that can be part of it. But I looked very closely at the way his quote is worded. And he says, I do not think that we have a systemic racism problem with law enforcement officers across the country. And I think part of that is not understanding what systemic racism is, because it cannot just be with the law enforcement officers, right? So this isn't about individual racism. This is about the policies in which they are governed by. This is everything, right? This is how they are hired. This is what the policies they are adhering to. This is also what brotherhood or things that they have going on and what they're being taught. This is their training. This is a lot of different things. And it's not just with one officer or some subset of officers. And in fact, if it was, it'd be very easy. It might be much easier to point out and to showcase what's going on. And I think that statement kind of speaks to more of his misunderstanding about what systemic or institutional racism really means, and the fact that it's different than individual racism, and it's different than that overt racism. It's more covert most times, and there's a lot of different layers of racism. Racism is not one thing, right? And so I think the question is a little bit odd and off.
This is a great conversation, an important one, and I want to tie it back to something Joki said a moment ago. And so I wonder, I haven't heard it yet, but I'm not as plugged in as you both are. Has there been a defund emergency management movement? Because, the same sort of critique that's been brought to address police, I mean, one of the arguments that's been made very powerfully in Minneapolis and other communities is that through mutual aid and other forms of social reform, we can move away from the idea of police coming from outside a community to somehow bring order into a community. In fact, we could say that this is the argument that they bring disorder. And I wonder and worry if emergency management cannot somehow be looped in. I'm not taking a position here, but I'm interested to see what you think about that, how you answer a community that would say, yeah, emergency management, same thing. It seems to be bringing order into our community, but we don't see it. And here's the director of Homeland Security, which oversees FEMA, saying he doesn't see structural racism in law enforcement officers. So why should we trust? So if I don't want to make you force you to take a position on that, but I'm curious to know if it doesn't somehow fall into this same broader discussion we're having in America right now.
Okay.
I was going to say emergency management is underfunded. I don't know that they have a lot of now.
Right.
Again, you have to separate Department of Homeland Security and then look at the FEMA emergency management. And I'm not even really thinking about FEMA. I'm starting to look at what's happening locally, right? I don't know that everybody knows who their emergency manager is or their departments. Some departments are run by 1, 2 people, 3 people most. So I don't know that that's exactly the same thing, because I'd like to separate here emergency management and emergency services personnel. So that's a little bit different. An emergency manager may work with law enforcement, may work with firefighters, may work with volunteers, may work with a whole bunch of public health. It works with a whole bunch of different units, but not necessarily over any one of them. If you look at some of the funding, I believe I saw some funding coming out of California in which all of the funding was going into law enforcement. And I think it was like 0.05% or something ridiculous like that goes into emergency management. And so when you start looking at these numbers saying defund emergency management, it's probably going to put us in a real pickle. later on if we are not already in it. I know there's tons of different ways. I'm looking at the time, and Joki, I know you have.
Yes, I actually do have something to say about this. Your question right now begins to address something that I had said earlier, which is that we will have to be more accountable about what it is that we are doing, right? Whether it is that we are not adequately and effectively communicating what our role is as emergency management, as professional emergency managers, which needs to happen. Whether it's a matter of we are not communicating our research, right, as effectively as we can, that is something that needs to be addressed. But when you step back and look at the role, at the definition of the role of emergency management and emergency managers, it's really very similar to the quintessential role of why the government was created in the first place, right? Which is to walk along, paraphrasing War, which is to walk alongside communities whenever their resources are overwhelmed. Okay, so if we have been meeting the community at the point where their resources are limited and overwhelmed, then we are doing our role. We are doing what our role is. Okay, so that's something that really does need to be clarified. So the question is, what is emergency management being funded for, right? And then on a larger scale, looking at approaches like humanitarian approaches, right, which are faulty to the extent that the assumption is that people are passive, or that people should be passive and not actively involved in their own form of emergency management, okay, at the individual preparedness level. So if we have not equipped people for that personal preparedness, then that's something that needs to be addressed. We need to be funded to be able to support that, whether it's equipping people with knowledge around pandemics, right? Whether it's in equipping people for whatever it is, Ebola, like we're seeing right now, there's an outbreak of Ebola in DRC again, within the context of COVID, and with all the changes that are happening around the world. How have we invested in people in that area? Or is there still the larger humanitarian approach where, people are passive, they need all the help at once, right? And then people, the people who are providing this support jet out. If we are talking about equipping people to meet the challenges collectively that they are facing, then we are relevant. Right? We are relevant to the people that we are working with. But to the degree that we are not, then it's no wonder that they perceive us in a way that really isn't right. So there's a lot of work to be done.
So we're coming up on time. Thank you both for those statements. Really, really powerful. And there's a couple of comments here from people who are listening in. Samantha Montano says there's not much to defund, to be honest, echoing something you both said. And then Patrick Roberts says, I suppose we defunded civil defense and replaced it with emergency management. I think that the way you both framed that defunding issue, showing the complexity, or the funding issue itself, maybe, again, this tangle of agencies, but also this sort of this sort of continual need for clarity of discussion of purpose. And then emergency management is not only reactive, but is also proactive towards what I think is often called mitigation, but it can also sort of mold very well onto ongoing sort of needs within society itself. I want to end with a question here that might move you. It comes from Patrick Roberts. It might move us to maybe a hopeful, constructive conclusion to our conversation here. He's asking for examples. He says, what are the best examples of working with NGOs, emergent groups, and community groups in emergency management situations today? So maybe if you could each give one example of some best practices, some creative work that you're seeing right now we can take away from this conversation.
I would like to
Yeah, Joki, you start.
Go ahead.
I thought, Joki, you're not talking?
Okay, I was actually going to highlight New Zealand as a country, okay, and the hope that we see there in the approach that they have used in handling COVID-19, beginning very early on in responding to the outbreak in China, and beginning to actively move towards implementing policies that they had. So at a national level, that's a country that, you know, I think is a good current example. At a personal level, I would like to highlight someone that I absolutely respect and admire for the work that she did as an individual responding to the Ebola challenge in Western Africa. Fatou Kekula was a trained nurse. Well, actually, she was still going through her nursing training, and her family members got sick, and there was no hospital available. There was no capacity in the hospitals. And so she realized that 4 of her sick family members were in really heavy dire straits. And so she, with the knowledge that she had, she took them back home in the village, tried as much as possible to quarantine them as best as she could, and using trash bags and makeshift, you know, some gloves and masks, she was actually able to, out of 4 infected family members, save 3, and she herself did not get infected, which from an Ebola perspective was just tremendous, right? So if we can look at such approaches that can apply across the board, that can be transferred or highlighted, right, then that is certainly a ray of hope.
So I would add here that one of the things that I think is needed, I guess, for practice and also for those who are teaching in the profession, would be a collection of some of these examples that individuals at the local level have seen working for them, because I don't know that we know all of them. There is one great, I guess, document that's out there, and it's more about social media and how it was used during Superstorm Sandy, and some of the things that they were seeing happening online with different emergent groups, different NGOs, and that gave me some, you know, more wider breadth. I mean, they even started talking about Occupy Sandy in there, and, you know, there were some concerns about that group in the beginning. So they learned, and they have it in like a sort of an after action report online that gives you a lot of information about different groups that came together, different private sector organizations that started working. And I thought that was a really good one. I've also been a part of a lot of really good starts to community groups at the state and local level, where they're bringing in, usually mine are around people with disabilities, but they start to bring in older adults, people with disabilities, and different community groups that are trying to make a coalition along with emergency managers at the state and local levels, so that they have a relationship prior to a disaster occurring. The only thing that I would say about those groups, again, is that when we do those as emergency managers, it's really good to have some of these coalitions during, you know, daytime conditions or whatever, but when you have a disaster occurring, is that you start to learn from your mistakes from that group, right, and actually apply the lessons learned. It seems to be a lot harder to learn from the groups and actually apply that to actually have those groups in place. So I've heard of a lot of coalitions around multitude of groups, either it's racial and ethnic minority communities, immigrant communities, people with disabilities, older adults that are out there, and I know they exist, and that is a great start. I think the next start is to learn from those communities and actually try to implement as much as possible. And those that have done it and done it successfully have started to have a better relationships with those communities that they're serving.
We've gone over the usual amount of time because it's been such a fascinating conversation, and I'm going to need to bring you both back. I want to thank my guests today, Didi Bennett and Njoki Marumba, and remind you, you've been listening to COVID Calls. We're on every weekday, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Tomorrow, we're going to continue our Academy of Natural Sciences discussions. We're going to talk about water and water quality and COVID-19. And we're going to also talk about water justice and environmental justice tomorrow. So please do join us for that discussion with Steph Kroll and David Volinsky from the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia. And just let me thank my guests again. Didi, Njoki, thank you so much for this time today. I really learned a lot from this discussion.
Yes. Thank you for having us.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow, 5 o'clock.